Chapter 3, The Food Supply, Screencast 1. Now, a couple of things that I want to address before we get too much further into this chapter. Notice we are starting with food production and organic products. We are not doing food security, so nothing related to food security will be covered in this class or in this chapter. So this is where we're starting. Now, if we go back, probably one of the most ancient ways as far as people to make a living was through food production. Now, that has drastically changed. And 1 in 3 people around the globe are actually involved in farming. And if we look at how much farming is occurring in the United States, it's actually less than 1% of the population. So a very, very small amount. And unfortunately, a lot of these small family farms are those that are getting pushed out. Although we do see some growth locally with regards to free-range, organic, and things like that. So the first thing we're going to really look at is this concept of organic products and organic foods. Now, when we look at organic, you're going to see this label, USDA Organic, indicating that it is. Now, organic foods are really available, but the issue here is because of the strict measures in which they are actually grown, they cost a lot more to produce. So typically they're going to be more expensive than what we consider to be more conventional foods. Well, there are some places where you can actually get really good deals on organic foods. Aldi's, for example, their produce is pretty much entirely organic, and their costs are pretty reasonable. Now, when we use the term organic, it really means how was that food produced. So it involves biological pest management, manure applications, composting, and then rotation of crops to maintain a healthy soil, water, crops, and animals. So those are the things that are implied when we use the term organic foods. And as I said previously, this is a lot more expensive than raising other types of foods overall. Now, things that are not permitted in the production of organic foods are synthetic pesticides, hormones, antibiotics, fertilizers, genetic engineering, sewage sludge, and irradiation. So once again, none of that can be used in foods that are classified as organic. When we talk about organic meat, poultry, eggs, and dairy products, they must all come from animals that have been allowed to graze outdoors and have only been fed organic feed. So once again, there's a reason why these foods cost a lot more, because the more stringent situations in which they're actually grown and produced. Now, generally, when we look at why people might choose organic foods, there's a number of different reasons. One is to improve the nutritional quality in their diets, reduce their intake of pesticides. And I think one of the things that I really like, if I'm going to choose organic foods, is supporting sustainable agriculture and these smaller farms. I think that's something really important overall. Now, one thing that we really aren't so sure about are what are the actual health effects of decreasing pesticide consumption. So we really don't know. But when we look at infants and young children, going organic with regards to foods might actually not be a bad thing, because once again, we don't really know the impact, that this might have with regards to commercially farmed food and grown food, etc. Now, when we look at probably another area that's relatively complicated now, it would be GMOs, or genetically modified foods. And what's happened here is genetic engineering. Scientists have actually altered the genetic makeup of a particular organism. And what they're using is this process of recombinant DNA. And what happens here, scientists actually transfer genes that typically confer specific traits. Now, much of the food that we see is genetically modified. I know there's a lot of people out there that do not believe in genetically modified foods, but you would really be surprised when you see the large volume of foods that are actually produced that are genetically modified. And a really good example would be papayas. You would not be able to get papayas regularly if they had not been genetically modified. And generally, this process here, okay, that they end up with after this recombinant DNA technology is known as a genetically modified food. Now, here's a really common example. Corn, so DNA of the host corn, and there's actually a gene, okay, that produces a protein toxic to the European corn borer. And this is a pest that is really responsible for ruining a lot of corn crops. Now, when this gene is inserted into the DNA of the corn plant, that corn plant has now become genetically modified. And what it does, because it's been modified in this particular manner, it now produces the Bt toxin. And so now you have a corn that is resistant to that pest, the European corn borer. So that's really why we see a lot of these foods that have been genetically modified. Instead of using a pesticide and some other things out there, foods can be genetically modified to enhance their growth overall. Now, when we look at probably the most common reason why foods may be genetically modified, one is to increase nutrient content. And we've also kind of addressed the other as far as creating some herbicide tolerance and or insect resistance. So that's a really important reason why we see genetically modified crops so often, because once again, you don't want to lose your crop to these pests and things like overall. And so this actually makes it for the farmer, okay, a much more reliable crop and more profitable. Excuse me. Now, one thing that they have done, and to me this is somewhat a concern, and the FDA has actually approved a transgenic farmed Atlantic salmon as safe, and this has been around for about 2015. Now, generally, it's not available in the United States until labeling and other regulations are improved. But if we look at this picture that I've included here, okay, on the bottom is a typically non-genetically modified salmon, and here we got a big old salmon that has been genetically modified. And so once again, this is allowing for a more healthy and efficiently produced food overall. But there are concerns, and actually this has already happened. One of the big concerns is that these transgenic animals will pass genes on into wild species or actually outcompete them for food. Look at the size, okay? So that is a big factor here. If you have the two of them, we're going to be looking at survival of the fittest, and this larger salmon is definitely going to have a greater chance of surviving than this smaller salmon overall. So that's a big concern, and there actually is evidence that transgenic animals have actually gotten into the wild population. So that, to me, is probably one of the biggest problems we see that's related to genetically modified foods. I think plants I'm pretty much okay with, but when we start looking at some transgenic animals, then I start to have some personal concerns about the process. Now, if we look at who's responsible for the regulation of genetically modified foods, there's a number of agencies. There's never just one agency when we look at what's happening with regulation of nutrients in foods in the United States. So here we have the FDA, the USDA, and the EPA. So all of these play some role. Now, the FDA has actually modified all genetically modified foods on the market and has found them safe to consume. But if you go out onto the internet, you're going to find a large number of sites and individuals that are really talking negatively about genetically modified foods, and quite often most of their statements are not really backed up by strong science for the most part. In 2016, so not so long ago, the U.S. Congress actually approved a mandatory labeling law for genetically modified foods, and they have to be identified with text, a symbol, or an electronic digital link such as a QR code. So that is required in the United States as of 2016. Now, if we look at some potential safety and other concerns about genetically modified foods, one of the things potentially is the addition of allergens to foods that previously did not contain them. One of the things that we see is glyphosate-resistant superweeds. So there's Monsanto. Okay, that's really what we're looking at there, having cross-species lines. One thing, the flow of genes from genetically modified crops to plants that are not intended to be modified. So really what we're looking at is the potential for these genetically modified food to actually get to these non-modified foods or the wild population. If we look at the development of particular insects that might be resistant to certain things, loss of genetic diversity. If many of you have gardens, some of you may actually grow heirloom tomatoes. And so these are tomatoes that have lots of cultural heritage. And that's a concern that genetically modified foods might result in the loss of this. Some other concerns are related to is there enough regulation around genetically modified foods? And the other is development of trade barriers. So these are all some concerns that are kind of related to genetically modified foods.